So this morning, as we think about where are we taking Jesus and think about taking him everywhere, I want to spend a little bit of time to consider taking Christ in competition. There are several iconic photos that some of us in the sports world may identify with as we consider who is the greatest. What is the greatest play? For those of you in football, you may remember this play. It was 1982, the NFC Championship game. 3rd and 3 for the 49ers in the closing seconds of their game with the Dallas Cowboys down by 6 points. Joe Montana to Dwight Clark. He catches it on his fingertips, and the 49ers kick the extra point and go on to win the game, the Super Bowl, and it starts a dynasty that those of you who are New England Patriots fan, this was the dynasty of the 80s and up through the mid-90s. Muhammad Ali, very famous for his claim, "I am the greatest." This photo is from his third bout with Joe Frazier. It was titled "The Thrilla in Manila." And those of us who are, I would say, old enough may remember this epic hockey game, 1980, Lake Placid, the U.S. against the Soviet Union. No one expected this group of undisciplined kids to be able to pull off such a feat. But they went on to beat the Russian team and then win their next game and the Olympic gold. Olympics often bring out the competitive spirit in many of us, and we celebrate those who are able to win gold. Many of us will remember also Mary Lou Retton, the first American to win gold in an Olympic gymnastics. She inspired multiple generations of girls to become gymnasts and to strive for gold. Keeping with the theme of sports, but moving to soccer, those of you who are fans of the soccer game will recognize Leo Messi, sometimes known as La Pulga. And I'm sorry, Enrique, I probably butchered that, but he's known as the Flea. Why? He's only 5'7", seems like a pest, but he can score from just about anywhere on the grid. And what about Usain, the lightning bolt? Fastest man in the world by far, not even close. Your aspirations may not be sports, perhaps it's music. You may recognize a young, and I emphasize young, Eric Clapton. Or maybe your aspirations are academic. Maybe you prefer to have the title CEO next to your name. In all of these things, we often are competitive. We're in rivalry with those around us. So how do we take Jesus with us? As we contemplate that, I want to talk a little bit about a story that occurred very early in the Bible, and that's the story of Cain and Abel. In chapter 4, we find that Eve is pregnant and she gives birth to Cain. Now there's a little bit of a wordplay here because Cain means I have gotten, I have bought. And there's a wordplay here that's interesting because Eve sees the birth of Cain as a fulfillment of the mission God gave her at creation. And it was also part of the curse following sin and the fall. So Eve may have very well believed, I have gotten a man. The origin of Cain's name in the Hebrew is the verb kaniti. I'm not a Hebrew expert, but reading a little bit and talking to others who know some about this, again, it translates to I have gotten or I have bought. So someone might use that in relationship to their shopping in the market, right? I have bought. Or today, those of you who go to the mall, you might use this kind of a verb in terms of what you talk about, you have acquired at the mall. So I have bought, I have acquired, now I possess. It's also an interesting play on words when you think about not just what Eve may have been thinking, but also the life choices that Cain made, his focus, his character. He was a farmer and he appeared to be settled and he had acquired much. He possessed much. He appears in the story to be more interested in what he can possess versus acknowledging the sovereignty of God. He is full of pride, maybe concerned about, I am the greatest. When you look at his brother's name, it is interesting. It has the root hava. And a couple of similar meanings may be applied here, generally vanity. Others have described it as fleeting, vapor, something that is here today and it's gone tomorrow. So very transitory. In some ways, it might remind us of the words spoken of in Psalms 103, where David says, man is like grass. He flourishes like a flower in the field. The wind blows over it, and it's gone. Its place remembers it no more. So here we have these two characters in the story of Cain and Abel. One is about possessing and owning, and I have bought. And the other is fleeting or vanity. And in the story, he's almost gone before he appears. In the story of Cain and Abel, we see that there is rivalry, there is competition that occurs very quickly. And this plays out as we look through the whole book of Genesis. Growing up, I had two brothers, so there were three of us. So I know a little bit about competition and rivalry. It happened every day for us. It didn't matter if we were playing football or softball or basketball. We could have been playing Monopoly or the stock market game or Scrabble, but there was always competition. Who was going to win? Who was going to be first? And so we see this played out with Cain and Abel, and then it follows on with the other characters that are introduced throughout Genesis. You have Abraham. He is promised to have kids and that are like the sand of the sea. Sarah realizes she's getting old, Abraham's getting old. You know, the parts and pieces don't work like they used to anymore, and so she thinks she needs to take things into her own hands. And so she offers her servant girl, Hagar, she offers her to Abraham in order to try to fulfill God's promise. And what happens? Very quickly, Hagar has a son, and now Ishmael is the firstborn. Ishmael is the one who is the heir. He has special status. And by his special status, Hagar now believes that she has value. See, she was just a worthless, nobody servant girl, and now she has the heir and she believes, I have value now. In fact, it created competition between not just the sons later on, but it also created competition and rivalry between the mothers, between Hagar and Sarah. And there's no doubt that Hagar probably helped with that. I can see her going, to Sarah and just trying to rub it in, because now Hagar has value. It doesn't end there, of course. You know the story of Isaac and Rachel. Twins born, Esau and Jacob. Rachel has preference for Jacob, and she wants him to be the one that wins out. Jacob gets tricked by his father later in life, and he ends up with Leah and Rebekah both. Of course, we all know that Jacob really loves Rebekah. But Leah was the one given to him first by his conniving father-in-law. Leah knows that she is not the preferred. She knows she has very little value. But then she begins to bear children to Jacob, and she has 3 or 4 sons. And now she thinks, perhaps he will think that I have value because I have borne him sons. I have given him a firstborn. I will have value. Of course, when Rebekah finally does have a son, Joseph becomes the preferred, if you will, of Jacob. And the brothers know it. They know that even though he's the youngest at the time, he's the one that their father really loves and adores. And Joseph, we've all worked with people that are what we call pot stirrers. And Joseph is good at that. He struts around in that coat of many colors. He wants his brothers to be jealous, and he wants them to know who their father really loves and cares most about. He even shares a dream, right, where they all bow down to him. And so Joseph stirs that pot. Joseph didn't learn either. When Jacob is getting ready to die in Egypt, Joseph brings his 2 sons to Jacob to be blessed. And Jacob crosses over his hands to bless the younger son over the older. And Joseph tries to correct him. But Jacob says, no, the younger will receive the special blessing. The older will be great also, but the younger will receive the special blessing. And so we see this culture, this human custom, where the oldest, the first, is given preferred value. They are giving higher priority. So this has been going on ever since the beginning of time. Moving back to the story of Cain and Abel, what is interesting there is that only a few seconds separate Abel from being the preferred person. Cain comes out first. He is celebrated. Abel follows, and he's almost like an afterthought. When we look at the story of Cain and Abel, one of the things that is striking is the offering that they bring. So when you look in Genesis chapter 4, and we look at the offering that they bring, what does Abel bring? He brings the best. He brings the firstborn of his flock and the best meat of that firstborn. What does Cain bring? He seems to bring just something. It's not clear what it is. Maybe it's whatever the leftovers were in the field as he was passing by. But it's clear that he does not bring the best. And how does this matter? What we see is that what seems to be important is not whether they brought a lamb or whether they brought fruit. But what matters is the spirit in which they brought this offering. What matters is the character in their lives. And what is interesting is that their offering seems to parallel their attitude toward God. Interesting verses are found in Isaiah chapter 1, verses 11 through 17, where Isaiah is talking about, or God is talking about, our offerings and our sacrifices. And he has this to say, "The multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me? I have more than enough of burnt offerings. I take no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats." And then you turn over into verse 17, and he says, here's what's really important. It's not what you offer, how much you give. What's really important is learn to do right. What does it mean to learn to do right? It says, seek justice, encourage the oppressed. These are words that we hear a lot about today, are they not? It says, defend the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. So what is it that you and I are doing for our fellow man? So when we go back to the story of Cain and Abel, their offerings appear to be a window into their soul, and it highlights what is important to them. We see after their offering, we see God's reaction. So going back to chapter 4 and into verses 4, 5, and 6, we see that the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor, and Cain was angry. So what's interesting here is that it talks about Cain's face being downcast. And the Lord says to him, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? And if you read the Hebrew there, you get the play on words, if you will, that goes along with that. So Cain's face is downcast because he is sinning. He can't look God in the eye. But God says, if you will obey me, if you will do what is right, you will be accepted. And the word can also be interpreted, your face will be lifted up. So we have a question here. What action will Cain take now that God is calling out his sin? What are the consequences of his reaction? And they turn out to be more eternal and far-reaching than that of his initial sin. One interesting observation when you look at this story is that we always talk about it in terms of the story of Cain and Abel, but really it's a story about Cain and God. It's a story about God's struggle for Cain's heart. It's a story of mercy. After Cain's sin is pointed out to him, God is saying, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? So historically, he knows that he has been sinning and where his heart has been. But if he will change his ways, God will look well upon him. In this story, Abel is only Cain's brother. Abel doesn't speak. There's no dialogue with God. He barely acts, and his only act is really a sacrifice he gives to God. And it's not clear that that's really recorded to document what Abel does or how good he is, as much as it may be to contrast with the state of Cain's heart and the sacrifice that Cain brings. In the verses of chapter 4, verses 8 through 11, we see three themes that are mentioned again and again and again. And the main one is brother. When you look at verses 8 through 11, you see brother mentioned over and over. Now Cain said to his brother, "Let us go to the field." And while they're in the field, Cain attacked his brother. The Lord says to Cain, "Where is your brother?" "I don't know," he replies. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord says, "What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse, driven from the ground, which opens its mouth to receive your brother's blood." So brother is a big deal in these verses. One of the questions that we see here is Cain and his responsibility for his brother. And what we find is his treatment of Abel, his brother, is intrinsically related to his relationship with God. He asks the question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And in some ways, when you look at it, he almost appears to be a cynic. You almost get the sense that Cain is asking God, "You knew that I was evil. You knew I might kill my brother. You had the power to stop it. You are culpable." This is a primary accusation that we often hear of the evil one towards God. You created this wonderful masterpiece, and now you have let it fall into shambles. You had the power to stop it. Interestingly, there are some parallels with Adam and the mission that Adam was given as we think about brother and am I my brother's keeper. In Genesis 2:15, God places Adam in the garden to work it, to care for it. In Genesis 1:27 and 28, God created man in his image, and man is given the directive to rule over it. And in this sense, rule over it is intended to convey care for, to enable its success. It is not about greed and what can I take from it for myself, what can I take to possess, but how do I care for it? In Psalms, David uses a very similar word to describe the rule of a king and what was expected of that king. It's found in Psalms chapter 72. And verses 8, 12, and 14. So here he talks about a king who will rule from sea to sea. And then what does it mean as far as how he will rule? He will deliver the needy who cry out, the afflicted who have no one to help. He will take pity on the weak and the needy and save the needy from death. He will rescue them from oppression and violence, for precious is their blood in his sight. So again, we see this theme of brother. Am I my brother's keeper? And how my relationship with my fellow man, with my brother, is indicative of my relationship with God. What we find here in this story is that God asked Cain a question, and it tells us a little bit about what God is thinking and what he wants for us. Doing right is synonymous with the approval of God. Doing right means I am a child of God. Our relationship with God is manifest by how we treat our brother. The disciple John gives a couple of examples of this in 1 John 3, verses 10 through 20. And we'll just look at a couple. He gives a negative example where he says, "Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother." So do not be like Cain. And then he talks about the positive side, where a few verses down, he talks about love, and that love is not just talking about something or wishing someone well. Love is action. And he says in verse 17, if anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need, but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? So this love for our fellow man that we are called to requires action. Doing right is seeking justice, as Isaiah says, encouraging the oppressed, defending the fatherless, advocate for the widow. In Matthew 25, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, Christ talks about this in terms of feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, care for the sick, visit the prisoners. So again, men place value on who finishes first, but God places value a little differently. He's concerned about the struggle. He's concerned about endurance. In Matthew 24:13, it says, he who stands firm till the end will be saved. Revelation 13:10, 14:12, where it talks about the saints and those who are faithful. John says, this calls for patient endurance and faithfulness. And so while we typically place priority and value on who crosses the finishing line first, Paul and the other authors of the Bible place more emphasis on how you run the race. So today, we have the Kentucky Derby, right? Will anyone care who comes into second? Will anyone care how well the second place finisher runs the race? If there are no's behind, no one cares. But in the world of God and in the world of our Bible, how you run the race is what's important. Paul says in 2 Timothy 4:7, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. And now we wait for the punchline because we expect him to tell us what his placement was. Was he first? Second? But Paul goes on to say, I have kept the faith. So Paul says the priority isn't where you place. The priority is, have you kept the faith? In sports, again, we watch performances. It could be a couple minutes in the case of the Derby. It could be a couple of hours in a football game. What we see is not the investment and the preparation that goes on behind the scenes, the work that happens during the off season, the training, the practice, the preparation. We don't see all that work, but all that work is typically very clear based on their on-field performance. Many of us will recognize here Jerry Rice, generally considered the greatest wide receiver ever to play in the NFL. His workout regimen was legendary, as were his practice habits. He's been retired about 15 years, and he still holds the records for yards, receptions, and TDs. Receptions, the closest guy is 200 behind him. He has almost 23,000 yards in receiving yards. The next closest is 6,000 yards behind. He has over 200 TDs in his career. The next closest competitors are running backs, who generally get more touches close to the goal line. He has 20% more TDs than even them. In the NFL Combine, which is kind of the pre-draft workout, Jerry Rice had a 40-yard dash record of 4.7 seconds. This is generally considered the top workout for the receivers who are going to be drafted. By comparison, The record for the 40-yard dash is 4.2 seconds by John Ross. Who's that? Or Rondell Menendez is tied for second at 4.24, or Dree Archer at fourth at 4.26. Stanford Root, Marquise Goodwin. Have we heard of any of those names? No, we haven't. And here's part of how that's explained in a book called Talent is Overrated, where the author explains Jerry Rice's training schedule. In team workouts, he was famous for his hustle. While many receivers would just trot back to the quarterback after catching the pass in practice, Rice would sprint to the end zone after each reception. He would typically continue practicing long after the rest of the team had gone home. Most remarkable were his off-season workouts. There was a hilly 5-mile trail he would reportedly run 10 40-meter wind sprints up the steepest part every time. Some of his teammates knew of his legendary workouts and decided to participate and see how well they could do. They generally would be sick or puking before the day was out. So why do I mention Jerry Rice? I think it's because it gets to Paul's point of how you live your life, how you run the race. Jerry wasn't just focused on being better than the guy lined up across the line of scrimmage or the guys lined up beside him. He was focused on getting a little bit better every single day and a little bit better every single year. Even when he was well known as the best, he continued to work on perfecting his route running, making sure he was going to be exactly where the quarterback was throwing the ball, and positioning himself for a catch while protecting it from the defense. So in closing, again, we have this story really not about Cain and Abel, but it's about Cain and God. It's about a relationship, how my relationship, your relationship with God is really manifest by how I treat my brother. Doing right correlates to the approval of God. And what does it mean to do right? It means to seek justice, to encourage the oppressed, take pity on the weak and the needy, in the words of Isaiah, and in the words of Christ found in Matthew, to feed the hungry, give drink, to clothe the naked, to visit the lonely. And I think in closing, the words found in Mark say it best. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his soul?